you look a little sad. Is something bothering you?
A couple of my friends ask me why I read my Bible and go to church. I wanted to say it's because I'm friends with Jesus, but I talked about lunch instead.
Were you afraid they'd make fun of you?
I guess. I just wish I was more like these guys.
Oh, they look like mighty men of valor. Brave, strong, and ready to fight in battle.
Yeah, I'm not strong like them.
They do have muscles on top of muscles. But don't worry, God has used heroes that weren't as strong on the outside or the inside. In Judges chapter 6 through 8, we can read about God's people, the Israelites. They chose to live their own way instead of God's way. So God allowed their enemies, the Midianites, to attack them. For 7 years, their enemies stole their crops and farm animals. The Israelites cried out to God to save them because their enemies were so horrible to them. God answered their prayer by choosing a judge, a real-life hero to rescue them. While this judge, Gideon, was hiding food from his enemies.
Wait, he was hiding? Gideon doesn't sound like a hero to me.
While Gideon was hiding, the angel of the Lord appeared and said, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." He said God had chosen him to fight and save Israel from the Midianites, and he even called Gideon courageous. But Gideon was scared. He said, "How can I do that?" God knew Gideon was weak, but when he uses weak people to do amazing things, he shows how powerful he is. God said he would be with Gideon, and the angel of the Lord proved it by doing a miracle. But Gideon was still very afraid, so later he asked God to show him another sign to prove he'd be with him. He asked God to make a fleece he left outside wet with morning dew, but leave the ground around it dry. And God did it. But Gideon was still worried. He asked God to prove himself again by making the ground wet and the fleece dry. And God did. The Lord was still going to use Gideon, even though our hero felt like he couldn't do what God wanted. 32,000 men gathered to fight their enemies. But God told Gideon, "Your army is too big."
What?
God wanted everyone to know that he was the one who was going to save the Israelites. He told Gideon to let all of the men who were afraid go home. 22,000 men went home. But the Lord said, "Your army is still too big."
But he only has 10,000 men left.
God said, "Take your army down to the water and send home anyone who doesn't drink a specific way." Only 300 men were left. And God said, "With those 300 men, I will defeat the Midianites."
Now the Midianite army is way bigger.
Over 400 times bigger.
How could such a small army win?
You know, when you feel too small to do what God wants you to do, he can still use you. The Lord said in 2 Corinthians 12:9, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." God knows your weakness, but his power is sufficient, which means it's enough. When God uses you, even though you are weak, he is pointing to himself to prove how awesome he is. Gideon was weak, but he chose to trust God. He instructed his men to hold a trumpet in one hand and a torch in the other. Then he told his men to put a jar over the torch to cover up its light.
Those are some pretty strange weapons.
They quietly surrounded the Midianite camp. Then Gideon blew his trumpet and threw his jar against the ground. His 300 men followed him, blowing their trumpets and smashing their jars. The Israelite army shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" And then light from the torches shone all around the camp. The Midianites didn't know what was happening. They thought they were surrounded, and they attacked each other in confusion. This allowed Gideon and his 300 men to defeat their enemies. That day, God made sure everyone knew he was the hero of this battle. Gideon trusted God, and God used Gideon for his good work, even though Gideon didn't think he was a mighty man of valor.
I want to be a mighty man of valor too.
Since you have believed in Jesus, God wants you to trust him for all life's challenges. And he wants to use you for his good work too. Remember, when you trust God, he can use you, even when you are weak, to show how great he is.
I know God wants me to tell my friends about Jesus, but I'm not very good at talking.
Well, next time you see your friends, ask God to use His power to help you, and then trust Him to do it. Start talking to them even if it is hard. Will you ask God to help you do the good work He wants you to do and trust Him to give you the power to do it?
Yeah!